أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. المفارقات والتناقضات جزء مهم من السياسة، ومن بين هذه المفارقات التي حدثت مؤخرا أن رئيسنا التاسع والثلاثين جيمي كارتر توفي قبل نهاية ولاية رئيسنا السادس والأربعين جو بايدن. عاش كارتر أطول من أي رئيس في التاريخ الأميركي. بايدن هو أول رئيس ديمقراطي يخدم لفترة ولاية واحدة فقط في البيت الأبيض منذ 45 عاما، وكان جيمي كارتر هو آخر رئيس ديمقراطي قبل بايدن خدم لفترة ولاية واحدة فقط. لا يذكر السياسيون أن كارتر كان رئيسا ناجحا، ولكن مع مرور الوقت بدأ المؤرخون في منحه المزيد من الثناء على إنجازاته. كيف سيتذكر التاريخ بايدن باعتباره الديمقراطي الوحيد الذي حزم دونالد ترامب؟ هل سيذكره كرئيس قام بالتعامل مع جائحة كوفيد، أم كزعيم أعاد بناء الطرق والجسور والسدود والمطارات في أمريكا، أو كرئيس مسؤول عن ارتفاع معدلات التضخم ومسؤول عن الانسحاب المخرج من أفغانستان وعن حربين غير منتهيتين وعن عودة دونالد ترامب للرئاسة؟ لمناقشة عرض جو بايدن يسعدني أن أرحب بمجموعة من الخبراء السياسيين راسل بيرمان وأليكس كانجيتانو وجايكوب رباشكين. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. We've come to the end of Joe Biden's presidency. Let's take a look at the 46th president and ask, how will he be remembered? With one word, Russell Berman, Alex Gangitano, Jacob Rabashkin, with one word, what's the one word that's most closely associated with Joe Biden? Russell?
I got to say oldest.
Oldest. All right. Oldest. Alex.
I'm trying to think of a term for not transitional. The fact that he went back on his vow to be a transitional president.
Okay. Not transitional. That's a new one. And Jacob.
I think beleaguered.
Beleaguered. All right. Very good. All right. Let's take a look more deeply at what President Biden accomplished and what some of his disappointments were. Alex, what do you think Joe Biden's greatest domestic achievement was as president?
That's a good question. I think my first thought was what he did with the Inflation Reduction Act. That had a lot to do with climate investments. He, I think, made a lot of climate activists very happy, and the work that he did and what he promised to do if he had gotten another term. But I do think his infrastructure law is the one that will actually follow him for the longest in terms of his legacy. I think that was such an overarching bipartisan law that affects so many communities in the U.S., red and blue alike. So I actually think that's one that, years from now, when there's a new bridge or whatever else in a district in some state, that if it has, this was built because of funding from the Biden administration, bipartisan infrastructure law, that will be a big part of his domestic legacy.
All right. Jacob, is there something else that comes to mind on the internal front?
Well, the answer I would have given you 2 months ago, perhaps, was defeating Donald Trump in 2020 and being the one who got himself in the way of a second Trump administration. But as we saw in November, that's no longer the case because Trump is going to be president again. And so I think that's a useful example for a lot of things that Joe Biden accomplished during his 4 years as president. We just don't know how many of them will be lasting and how many of them the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, will work to undo as quickly and thoroughly as they can, aided by a favorable Congress and a favorable judiciary. I agree. I think the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and the boom we've seen in semiconductor manufacturing all across the country is absolutely going to rank highly in terms of Biden's achievements in addition to the climate investments. But ultimately, I think we're several years out from knowing just how much of the Biden administration will persist past the second Trump administration.
And Russell, when you look at Joe Biden's domestic legacy, what's a big disappointment in your view?
Well, that I think that he didn't get more of his what he called his Build Back Better plan enacted. He did get the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a compromise with more conservative Democrats, and did a lot for the climate, for lowering prescription drug costs. But he had much more ambitious plans in that Build Back Better plan. The expanded child tax credit that he actually did get in place for a year or two early in his term expired, and he was not able to renew that. There were a whole host of policies that would have expanded the social welfare state, the social safety net in the United States that he wanted to get, that he just wasn't able to because he had such narrow majorities, Democratic majorities in his first 2 years. And then, of course, the Republicans retook the House for his second 2 years, and that stopped almost all legislation.
Yeah, I'm going to throw one more item in terms of domestic achievements. Let's not forget it was Joe Biden who led America through the tail end of COVID, and with some efficiency, got vaccines out there to people around the country. No small achievement, especially now we see that vaccines, the very idea of them is under dispute. And another disappointment, any other disappointments, Alex, Jacob, on the domestic front, in addition to what Russell had to say?
Well, I do think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, and the disappointment of because he wasn't able to accomplish more. And a lot of that had to do with, I think, his plans for a second term that were cut extremely short over this summer when he had to drop out of the 2024 race and Vice President Harris had to take over the ballot. I think that's a disappointment just for the situation that now Democrats are in, because they are obviously looking to rebuild their party and figure out what's next, but also there were a lot of things that they wanted to accomplish in the climate space or child tax credit, like Russell was saying, that now they won't be able to. If anything, they'll be backtracking if Republicans start to undo some of the work that Biden did. So I think Democrats were really banking on another Democratic administration, whether that was Biden or whether he had dropped out earlier and it was another Democrat, Kamala Harris or somebody else. They were hoping for 4 more years just to accomplish some more of those goals, and did not get that.
So, Jacob, earlier, Alex referred to Joe Biden as the non-transitional president. He did come in saying, I'm going to be the transition. At what point do you think he decided, you know what? There's 4 more years in this for me. Was it from the very beginning, or is it somewhere along the way?
I'm not convinced that Joe Biden ever saw himself as anything other than an 8-year president. I don't think that any president in the modern era, certainly, maybe James K. Polk, but since then, I think every president has seen themselves as an 8-year or 16-year president in one instance. And I think that was true of Joe Biden. I think he said certain things during the 2019 and 2020 Democratic presidential primary because he felt he had to in order to get past the fact that he was the oldest he would be the oldest president if he were elected, and that was clearly a concern for voters even back then when he was not nearly as old as he is now. And so he said things like, that he wanted to be a bridge to the next generation. He got up on stage with Beto and Cory Booker and any number of other younger Democrats and tried to present himself as that transitional figure. He never explicitly committed to only serving one term. He allowed people who wanted that to be true to read that into his statements. But I don't think that he ever gave up the belief that he was going to serve 2 terms. And it took such an extraordinary set of circumstances to push him out over the summer. And if you believe some reporting now, he still believes that he would have beaten Trump and been able to serve a second term. So I don't think he ever really saw himself as a 4-year president.
Interesting. Russell, Alex, do you agree with that? Joe Biden, 8 years from the very beginning? Russell?
Yes. Joe Biden, remember, he has a huge ego, even though he kind of comes off as a kindly grandpa to the country at times. He ran for president 3 times, won that 3rd time. He has been in the Senate or vice president or president for 50 years as a politician. And so the idea that he just wanted a single term, I think at any point is hard to believe. I totally agree with Jacob that he probably uttered that line and may not have even, Joe Biden, famously known for occasionally making gaffes. I think you might even consider that a gaffe, because I don't really think he meant it. I think he said it in the heat of a political campaign and to reassure people who still wanted a younger standard bearer in 2020. But that's the kind of promise or the kind of thing that you say on the campaign trail that tends to go away once you're elected.
Interesting. And Alex, and you concur with this?
I do. I think if you also look back at some of those pivotal interviews that Joe Biden did after his debate against President-elect Trump, and so in early July, just how defiant he was about, no, I am definitely not dropping out. I'm staying in this race. I'm the person who beat Trump the first time, and I'm the person that's going to do it again. He had such a stubbornness to him at the time, and definitely looked at himself as the only Democrat who could beat Trump. And as Jacob alluded to, maybe he still feels like he could have beat Trump. And I think if you look back at some of those, he definitely felt like this was an 8-year presidency. And it just took until things got so dire for him that the party was turning against him for him to have dropped out. I think it would have had to reach that tipping point, and he wasn't going to let another 4 years let go if he hadn't have reached that.
All right. Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to turn to foreign policy, greatest achievements, biggest disappointments, and I will eventually ask the question, how would Joe Biden finish the sentence? If I could do it all over again, I would have fill in the blank in just a moment. Our guests today include Russell Berman. Russell is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers American politics. Formerly, he was a writer and producer for the venerable and often contentious McLaughlin Group on American television. Also with us is Alex Gangitano. Alex is White House reporter at The Hill, where she was previously the lobbying reporter. Earlier in her career, she was a staff writer for CQ Roll Call, where she authored Heard on the Hill. And with us today is Jacob Rabashkin. Jacob is a reporter and analyst with Inside Elections, an online platform where he provides analysis of political campaigns from the State House to the White House. Prior to joining Inside Elections, Jacob worked at NBC News in Washington and for CNN's political unit. So when we go abroad, Jacob, what do you think the Biden administration, Joe Biden, considers his greatest foreign policy achievement?
I think that you have to look at the support the U.S. has marshaled for Ukraine in its war against Russia as one of the crowning foreign policy achievements of the Biden administration. The Biden administration was very vocal very early on about the threat that Russia faced to Ukraine. It's hard to imagine or remember these days, but in the months leading up to that war, Biden was sounding the alarm while Zelensky was saying no problems here, nothing to worry about. And the resources and strength that Biden has given the Ukrainians has allowed them to withstand an incredibly aggressive Russian invasion for more than 2 years. Now, this is a tiny nation with not a lot of resources that has stood up to a country that everyone kind of thought of as one of the main superpowers of the world. And I think that has been proven a little bit false. So absolutely, in a term that has been marked by any number of foreign policy mishaps, the ability of Biden and the West to support Ukraine in the struggle against Russia, I think will stand the test of time.
All right. Ukraine, even though the war isn't over, we've certainly amazing American support for Ukraine. Does something else rise to the top of your list, Russell Berman?
No, I would say that one as well. From a certain segment of the U.S. population, even though Afghanistan and the fall of Afghanistan and the sort of very violent, chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan will be a stain on his legacy, the fact that he did finally get America out of Afghanistan after 2 decades of war, for a fairly significant portion of the population, will be an achievement as opposed to a stain. Now, the way that it went down at the end, there's debates about whether it could have gone better or whether that was going to be the inevitable result, give or take a few casualties. Ultimately, that's going to be a topic for debate. But the fact of the matter is, the United States is no longer at war directly in the Middle East, and that's something that Biden can take some credit for.
All right. Some people would have put this also at the top of the list of foreign policy disappointments. So maybe it hits both lists. Alex, is there something about foreign policy, some additional item that the president should be especially proud?
I think his ability to have come in after the first 4 years of Trump and the kind of America First isolationist agenda, which now looking back, Trump has been embraced by a lot of foreign leaders since he was reelected. And so we'll have to see how history plays out if Biden's moves towards, bringing America back, so as he likes to say, actually paid off. But that was one of his big vows on the campaign trail in 2020, was to not be so isolationist and bring America back to the NATO and other groups in on the foreign policy stage as a leader, but also as someone who can work with these other countries. And I think that's a lot of what he was able to do with aid to Ukraine, was unite other countries behind helping Ukraine as well. And so since that was something that he vowed to do, he was successful in it. But if it was as necessary to bring America, quote unquote, back, as he made it seem to be after the Trump years, that's something that's a big question mark, because now with another 4 years of Trump, we'll see if he proceeds with this America First agenda, if kind of Biden's work on NATO and wherever else will be erased, and how that all plays out.
All right. Foreign disappointments. Russell, you mentioned Afghanistan. There has to be other items that compete for near the top of the list of disappointments in foreign policy.
Well, certainly the situation with Israel and Gaza is going to rank as a disappointment. And certainly the fact, the way that he handled that whole situation, you could argue that there really wasn't going to be a politically advantageous way for him to handle that, given the divisiveness in U.S. politics over Israel. But he clearly lost a lot of support on the left and among younger voters by being so resolutely defensive of Israel's war in Gaza, and to a large extent defending Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, it seems like that was not the decisive factor in the election, in Kamala Harris's election defeat, but it certainly clearly hurt him in some areas, especially in Michigan, and I think it contributed to a drop in his popularity among some progressives and certainly among younger voters.
All right. The Middle East at the top of the list of disappointments. Anything else that people will remember, you think, 50 years from now in terms of a foreign policy disappointment?
No, I think that the situation in Gaza has to rank as number one for Biden on so many levels. We're now a year and 3 months into such a tragedy, and there is no matter what kind of your viewpoint is, certainly on the American political spectrum, I don't think there's anybody who looks at Joe Biden and says he handled it well. They're happy with the decisions he made. I think he tried to pursue a strategy to please everyone, and he ended up making nobody happy. And when the story is written, I agree with Russell that Afghanistan was very, disruptive in the moment. But when history looks back at it, I think people see Joe Biden as the president who got us out of Afghanistan. Gaza, I think, is an entirely different story.
Okay. Alex, anything else?
I agree with both these. I think Afghanistan was a tough situation they were in, and it was maybe more chaotic than it needed to be. But at the end, he is the president that got us out of Afghanistan. And I think if Trump had won re-election in 2020, he would have been the president to do so. And we don't know how that withdrawal would have looked like, but it was time either way. But I do think when it comes to the war in Gaza, when, history books are writing about civilian casualties and the children, and how, the hostages, especially including some Americans, have still not been released. All of that, I think, will look poorly on President Biden, that he didn't do more. And I think as Jacob referenced, he tried to play this middle ground of I'm supportive of Israel, I'm close with Netanyahu, who I think looking back at times totally ignored President Biden to the point that it was embarrassing for this president. And I think he'll be remembered for that. But also as he tried to be supportive of the people of Gaza and say that, there's too many civilian casualties. And so him playing this middleman, I think, just turned out to be to his detriment.
All right. Well, interesting. We will see how historians remember this years from now. When you think about the Biden years, when you think about Joe Biden's, as you referred, Russell, his gaffes, his speeches, the way he talks, is there one line for which Joe Biden will be remembered? One sentence, one phrase, which is a Bidenism. Jacob, what do you think?
Oh gosh, there's so many to pick from. I think he, and I won't say it on air here, I think he made a remark to then President Obama at the signing of the Affordable Care Act all the way back in 2010, I guess, emphasizing how big a deal the Affordable Care Act was. And I still think, to me, that is the biggest expression of Joe Biden as a guy who was not afraid to swear on a hot mic about a major progressive accomplishment that, probably wasn't the right thing to say in that moment, but he had the spirit. And, I think that in so many ways, the Biden administration existed in the shadow of the Obama administration. And in a lot of ways, I think Joe Biden, the president, existed in the shadow of the person that we thought, of Joe Biden as when he was vice president. I think that's the persona that he won the election based off of.
All right. Terrific. Thank you very much, Alex Gangitano, Jacob Rabashkin, Russell Berman, for giving us a look into how America will remember our 46th president Joe Biden. Thank you for joining me this week on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، خاصة فيما يتعلق بالأرث المتغير للرؤساء السابقين، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.